In this video, we're going to look at navigating the RAMP API or Application Programming Interface for writing Python or .NET code using the RAMP libraries. So if I click on the API reference in the development documentation in the RAMP GUI, it takes me to the API reference documentation area. The introduction talks about the DLLs, or the dynamic link libraries, that RAMP uses, and it's important to understand these. So the most important one is RAMP core. This contains all of the core RAMP functions, such as defining what a raster actually is, defining the template for a processor, all these sorts of things. So it is the core library for RAMP. And in .NET terminology, this DLL has a namespace called RAMP. The other ones that are equally important, probably the next most important one that you'll use, is processes.dll. This tends to be the DLL that contains all of the different processes and the processor methods in RAMP. And that generally uses a namespace called ramp.processes. If you're not familiar with namespaces because you're a Python programmer, you'll need to understand these later on. So just have a quick look on the Microsoft website to try and understand them. Other useful DLLs in RAMP are the renderers. These are the methods that allow you, or functions that allow you, to generate rendered rasters, so to apply color maps and color palettes to rasters. Raster factories are also kind of useful too. What you probably won't use is tools.dll, because the tools library generally contains things in the ramp.tools namespace, and these are like the tools that we know in the RAMP graphical user interface, like for example the raster calculator. These are things that tend to have, here's the raster calculator. These are the things that tend to have a graphical user interface. So you're probably not going to call these. You're probably going to stick to just using RAMP core, processes, renderers, and maybe raster factories. RAMP also makes use of a number of other dynamic link libraries, or libraries itself. So these RAMP libraries also use other libraries. And you can see some of them here. So we have a third-party library for working with shapefiles. We have a third-party library for doing Fourier transformations, working with scalable vector graphics, working with AutoCAD files. There's a Jodeci library that's developed for RAMP. The same with the Konsberg readers, the SegY libraries, the Triton XTF libraries. These are all additional libraries that RAMP calls on. And you can go ahead and use any of these libraries as well if you want to. So let's have a look where these libraries are actually distributed in your RAMP installation. If I go to my RAMP installation directory, it's capps bin ramp in this case, and I click on my bin folder, I'll see all the binaries and all of the dependencies that RAMP actually utilizes. And you'll see that a lot of the DLLs are in here. For example, there's Jodeci. Let's have a look. There's the processes library, and here's the all-important RAMP core library. So that's physically where these libraries are located, so that if you need to reference them in your Python projects or your .NET projects, you know where to go to get hold of them. So back to the API documentation. You'll notice that each of the main RAMP libraries has a corresponding namespace. We talked about that already. And in the left-hand box here, you can look at individual namespaces and see what classes, interfaces, enumerators, and something that we've called implementation classes. Implementation classes are generally classes that implement a predefined interface. That's how we've used the terminology anyhow. So I know automatically all of the classes that are in the RAMP core DLL and the RAMP namespace. So one of the most important ones, obviously, to RAMP is the raster class. And if I click on it, it tells me So it's inheritable. It tells me what objects can inherit from it, and it gives me a full breakdown of the constructor methods, the properties, are they read-only, read-write properties, and all of the methods and functions that I can call with the arguments and a short description about what they do. Most of these then also come with some code examples about how you can call and use some of the methods in that class. So this is a great source of information. If I scroll down, I can look at the renderers, and I can look at what's in a single band renderer and what all the options are. So the documentation, I should make mention, uses this kind of naming convention. So like a less than sign and a dash indicates either a method, a function, or a constructor method. This indicates a read-only property, whereas this is a read-write property. A asterisk dash is a static method or function, and anything that has z dash is an event. So that's generally the terminology that so the convention that we utilize when describing the methods, properties, functions, and so forth in each of the classes or interfaces. Okay, let's look at some commonly used functions now, or methods in RAMP. And the first one I want to draw your attention to is in the RAMP namespace, so RAMP core DLL. And the utils class has a series of static functions. And two of the most important ones to RAMP are the read and write static function. This allows you to say, read this input file, it's in this format, and to return a raster. It's usually the starting point, and write is usually the ending point of many bits of code that we write. So we'll look at how to call that a little bit later in some subsequent videos, how you use those in Python and .NET Framework. The other important one, obviously, is utils out. So this allows me to write messages or send exceptions as a static function, and this handles everything that you need to in terms of it puts the date timestamp in front of the messages. It looks at the stack, so what was calling them. So all that stuff that happens in the RAMP GUI down here in process info is as a result of something calling utils.out and passing it a message. This also allows you to, when you're doing exception handling with out, to set a prompt that determines whether the exception will be displayed to a dialog box. So that's if you've got if you're implementing a graphical user interface and you're not capturing standard output, you can prompt that and it will display it in a dialog box. So they're really useful too. Obviously, the most important object in RAMP is the raster itself, and I'll just point out a couple of the properties and methods in here. So xmin, xmax, ymax, that's the spatial bounds of the raster. Rows and columns is the number of rows and columns in the raster data set. The dn properties are the statistical properties in terms of the max, min, mean, standard deviation, skewness, kurtosis. So there's statistical properties of the cell values in the raster. And then I can do things like I can get the cell value given a specific X and Y location, or the cell value given a specific interpolation method. So I might say, get me the bilinear value at this cell, or the IDW, the inverse distance weighted, that sort of thing. I could also use this to set values of cells. So lots of stuff in here that can be of use, and it's the basis for many of the functions and methods that you will build on in or call from RAMP. The other thing that you're likely to routinely do is call processor methods. So I might, for example, want to call I want to generate a slope. So I might use my terrain analysis processor, and I want to call the terrain analysis slope third order difference method. So if I click on that, it tells me pretty quickly at the bottom. So this is traditionally what we see when we click on that method in the RAMP graphical user interface or in RAMP flow, for example. But it also tells me here there's a little section at the bottom, the API reference. It says, hey, if you want to call slope third order finite difference, use the processor DLL, use this namespace and grab this class called terrain analysis, and then simply just call this function, slope third order finite difference, give it a raster, give it a slope type, and it's going to return you a new raster. So any documentation that I want to access around processes or anything that implements the iProcessor interface, as it's known in RAMP, you can go straight to the documentation here, kernel resampling, scroll to the bottom. Oh yeah, that's what I need to call to do kernel resampling. Let's look at rendering. I want to render a blended image. Scroll to the bottom. It gives me, in this case, two different options for how I can blend different rasters together. So that's how you navigate this documentation. So whilst the API reference is here for the core objects, once I click on something like an implementation class, for example, so let's go to processes, local terrain analysis. Let's go here. Terrain analysis. It doesn't list all of the properties and methods. It takes me to the processor documentation, and then I pick what method I want, and then I look at what method to call within the library and class that it tells me to use. So that's been a quick introduction to navigating the API documentation in RAMP. It'll become a lot clearer in subsequent videos where we will use the documentation along practical examples of how you implement things in Python and C#, for example. Thanks for watching this video. I hope it helped.